Okay, so welcome everybody to the Wisdom of the Pathwork lectures. This is a sort of every other week um, exploration of the Pathwork lectures. They were uh, channeled material that came in from a medium by the name of Eva Paracas. And she started channeling these particular lectures that came from a being of some considerable wisdom back in 1958, and then in 57, I think, is really the first one, and then she died in 1978. So um, there's 258 of these lectures plus some other materials. So this is a continuation of a series from a couple of weeks ago where we did a sort of AI overview of the pathwork understanding of evil from several different lectures and perspectives. Now we're taking a deep dive into the first one of those lectures. So this was channeled May 28th, 1965. It's titled The Concept of Evil. Greetings, my dearest friends. May this lecture prove helpful and thus a blessing. May these words shed light and clarification into your groping search for liberation. I should now like to discuss a topic that I have so far touched upon only indirectly: the concept of evil. Traditional religion postulates that evil is a separate force. According to this concept, people have to cope with making decisions between good and evil. Some philosophies postulate that there is no such thing as evil. It is only an illusion, and in reality it does not exist. This statement is often misunderstood even by the proponents of this philosophy. The denial of the manifestations of evil is as illusory as the belief that evil represents a separate aspect in the universe. In this lecture, I would like to present a deeper understanding of evil, which will be extremely helpful for all my friends who are deeply involved in the process of self-finding. So it's interesting too, even here where he talks about, that when we think of evil as representing a separate aspect of the universe, that's part of, like the separation aspect is one of the aspects of, how evil can manifest. And so he's saying, like, even evil is a part of the whole, is part of the oneness. And then, what is, happens with it, he develops in this lecture, I think, in a good way. So he says, evil is or results from numbness and a confusion about the execution of control. Why is evil numbness? When you think of the defense mechanisms operating in the human psyche, the connection between numbness and pain and evil become quite clear. Children who feel hurt, rejected, and helplessly exposed to pain and deprivation often find that numbing their feelings is their only protection against suffering. This is often a useful and quite realistic protective device. Likewise, when children are confused because they perceive contradiction and conflict around them, equally contradictory emotions arise in their own psyches. Children cannot cope with either. Numbness is also a protection against their own contradictory responses, impulses, and reactions. I think another thing that you can say is numb, like one other aspect, it's like it goes unconscious, right? It's like we can't make sense of it, and so it's kind of like denied, it's buried in a way, and that, is a lack of awareness, a lack of, consciousness. And so numbness is a lot of times how it actually feels in the body and in the energy system. Um, but it's he's talking about this kind of defense process, and he says when such numbness has become second nature and is maintained long after the painful circumstances have changed, and when the person is no longer a helpless child. This, in the smallest measure, is the beginning of evil. This is how evil is born. Numbness and insensitivity toward one's own pain, in turn, means equal numbness and insensitivity toward others. So, when examining one's reactions closely, one might often observe that the first spontaneous reaction to others is a feeling for and with them, a compassion or empathy, a participation of the soul. But then the second reaction restricts this emotional flow. So Jeff is joining us, another unusual addition. Hi, Jeff, welcome. So we're just sort of reading through this lecture. So it's on evil, and we're sort of talking about it as a way that the protection in situations of pain when we're helpless causes us to choose numbness, to avoid the pain. And it's in some small measure this numbness that is the beginning of evil. And so numbness and insensitivity towards one's own pain in turn means equal numbness and insensitivity towards others. And I think that's an important key to kind of highlight, that it always starts towards our own self, towards our own, and then it, kind of just naturally, is generalized in a sense, right? And so when we sort of deny or, tell ourselves we should be tough, or, something like that, then there's a way that, we're sort of trying to numb ourselves out. And there's a certain insensitivity that we have towards our pain, and even just, feeling like, oh, somehow I shouldn't be having this pain, or whatever, is this kind of abandonment of the truth of what we're experiencing, right? And a kind of rejection of what spirit, what's really happening. So Frank is joining us. Welcome, Frank.
Hi, Darlene. Sorry I'm late. I forgot about the meeting.
Oh, good. I'm glad. I mean, I think we kind of got off a track a little bit, but anyway, I'm glad you caught it. And so, yeah, we're, a little ways into the lecture on, the concept of evil, and the guide is talking about, the connection of the numbness, to protection that we instill, and then how that numbs us, and makes us insensitive towards our own pain, and then there's an insensitivity towards others.
Right.
And so he says, when
This is a
examining
continuation of the
yeah, what we
last
were
time.
doing, like we did the sort of that AI overview, and now I'm actually going to read each of those lectures that are,
Okay.
and so we're now just like going directly into the, inspiration of the lectures.
Okay.
So this is the guide, or Eva, when examining one's reactions closely, one might often observe that the first spontaneous reaction to others is a feeling for and with them, a compassion or empathy, a participation of the soul. But the second reaction then restricts this emotional flow. Something clicks inside and seems to say no, which means that a protective layer of unfeelingness has formed. It's like we might pull back, or we might feel, like some cautionary thing maybe as well. So, but the minute that we do that, the flow, right, the connectedness and the flow is, blocked, and so a level of numbness is happening. And in that moment, one stands separate, apparently safe, but separate. And then later, this separateness may be overcompensated by false sentimentality, dramatization, insincere, exaggerated sympathy. We see this a lot out in the world, sort of the mask of how one is supposed to feel about these things. And yet they really are only substitutes, kind of cover, like for that numbness. And the numbness instituted for oneself inevitably spreads to others, just as every attitude toward the self is bound to expand toward others. So any comments or questions so far? So we might differentiate between 3 stages of numbness. First, numbness toward the self, a protective mechanism. Second is the numbness toward others. In this stage, it is a passive attitude of indifference that enables one to watch others suffer without feeling discomfort oneself. Much of the world's evil is caused by this state of soul. Because it is less crass, in the long run, it is more harmful, for active cruelty induces quicker counter-reactions. Passive indifference, however, born out of numbing the feelings, can go unnoticed because it can so easily be camouflaged. It permits the person to follow the most selfish impulses without open detection. Indifference may not be as actively evil as cruelty acted out, but it is just as harmful in the long run. So, and we can, kind of relate to, some of that, is out there and within us, right? So as I'm reading this, see if you can locate, especially within your own self, like any of these things, and, like don't be judgmental about it, right? It's like this is where, the more we can just understand, and like then the higher self can make a difference. And the second part of this lecture is just an amazing uh, invocation of the higher self. So hang in there as we go from evil to something beyond. So the third stage of numbness is actively inflicted cruelty. This stage arises from fear of others who seem to expect such acts, or from an inability to cope with pent-up rages, or from a subtle process of strengthening the protective device of numbness. So, oh, hi, Davis. Welcome. Yeah, so, yeah, this is a good lecture. You might take a look at it, or, look at the recording. So, but, he's talking about these 3 stages. And so the first stage of numbness is sort of numbness towards ourselves, right? And then that stage of numbness kind of pours over, so that there's a passive indifference towards others. And he's saying that, that kind of numbness is really, like, in the larger scheme of things, like a lot of darkness and ugliness comes out of that, and yet, like the active cruelty acted out, is also, extremely harmful. But he's saying indifference, may not be as actively evil as cruelty acted out, but it's just as harmful in the long run. And then this third stage is this actively inflicted evil. And he's got some interesting things, I think, to say about this. This stage arises from fear of others who seem to expect such acts. So I think he's listing a few reasons why it arises. So it could arise from fear of others who seem to expect such acts, or from an inability to cope with pent-up rages, or from a subtle process of strengthening the protective device of numbness. So at first this may appear incomprehensible, but when you think about it deeply, you will find that people may occasionally, almost consciously, find themselves on the brink of a decision. Either I allow my feelings to reach out in empathy, with the other, and sensitivity and connection and softness, and so I either do that, or in order to deflect this strong influx of warm feelings, which can seem dangerous, basically. There's fear, even that I have to behave in the exact opposite way. And so there's a kind of, again, defense that's activated there. And so then the next moment, such reasoning is gone and the conscious decision forgotten. And what remains is a compelling force toward cruel acts. In these instances, all harm, all destructiveness, all evil results from denying the spontaneous real self and substituting secondary reactions that in one way or another are always connected with fear. So let me say that again. In these instances, all harm, all destructiveness, all evil results from denying the spontaneous real self, which is what he's saying, is naturally wants the connection, naturally, but then we're afraid, and so then the defense comes up, and then sometimes that defense is an active, fear that goes into fight and instead of flight, and so or rage, or so substituting the secondary reaction that in one way or another that is always connected with the fear. So the borderline between passive numbness and active cruelty is often very thin and precarious, very much dependent upon apparently outer circumstances. If people understand these processes, not only intellectually but within themselves, they are adequately equipped to cope with the world's cruelty, which so often gives rise to despair, doubt, and confusion. So, it's interesting here. It's kind of saying, like the more that we can understand these processes, then the more that we can cope with and understand, this, aspect of the world that seems, like for many of us to give rise to despair, doubt, and confusion. So active cruelty numbs the person who perpetrates it to an even greater extent. It not only prohibits the influx of spontaneous positive feelings, but also wards off fear and guilt. The act of inflicting pain on others simultaneously kills off one's own ability to feel. So I don't know if you can recognize that, but, there is a, kind of a numbing effect in like actively sort of wanting to hurt. And so, and I think, it's a stronger device to attain numbness, as the guide is saying, so again, I don't know if this makes sense, if you can recognize any of this, like we all have some of this. Sometimes, it's, more balanced and healed, and sometimes, it's like we're still really working deeply, because that's really part of what the journey is for. And, to, bring all of this into the light for the transformation, right? And so we want to, like realize that just our willingness to be here and, look at our own cruelty or our own numbness or our own, lower self aspects, like that is really, what makes our, like desire to live the life of the divine more real somehow, right? You can't just say, oh, I want this, without really looking at the shadow. And then it's very hard, and I spent a long time early on in the path work, like really having difficulty looking at my shadow parts, because I had so much fear and shame of them. So I like to remind people that even if they find these tendencies, that it's really a beautiful thing just to acknowledge them, to understand them deeply, to, find in our story ultimately, maybe where we came by them, in our early experience, in our helplessness, and the guide's going to talk about some of that coming up here. So, it really is important for us to maintain that sort of compassionate connection with our own life and our own story and our own challenges and our own difficulties. And to know that, as we bring them into the light, that in itself is, our own light doing that, and that determines who we are. So we carry light, or we have the darkness, but we are the light, right? And so we want to just kind of keep doing the beautiful job of bringing all the darkness into the light in ourselves, and maybe in the world. Each one of us is called in different ways. So he says you must always distinguish between the active deeds of either indifference or cruelty and emotional tendencies. The indifference or numbness may not be actively executed. So, it's possible to experience this non-participation and numbness, but not act upon it. You may do all you can to help another, perhaps sometimes even overdo it, just because you do not wish on the conscious level to be so indifferent. The desire to hurt others may exist merely as an emotion, without ever being acted upon. However, when you feel guilt, you do not differentiate between these vital manifestations. So it makes no difference whether you feel or act in destructive, harmful ways. Hence, the entire trouble area is denied, pushed out of consciousness. This is where he's saying we have trouble facing, and where it can no longer be corrected. So admitting, acknowledging, facing an emotion, no matter how undesirable, can never harm the self or others. And it's eventually bound to dissolve the negative feeling. Confusing the impulse with the deed, confusing either of those with our real self, they're aspects of ourself. Again, we have these aspects. So they're not really who we are. And so if we confuse, and if we confuse the impulse with the deed, and therefore denying both, result in extreme disturbance for the self. And that indirectly affects others, and there's no hope of change as long as the process remains unconscious. Seen in this light, it will be clear that numbness in its extreme becomes active cruelty. The difference between these two is only in degree. It is exceedingly important for you to understand this, my friends. For those who are most shocked, afraid of, and unable to cope with the existing cruelty in the world, and suffer most by the mere acknowledgement that it exists, have inevitably made themselves numb in some way and consequently suffer from guilt. I thought that was a very interesting, turnaround and approach, a way to look at it there, right? And because I, sometimes identify with, I'm like shocked and afraid of, and sort of like, I'm coping, but, it's like sometimes, the amount of darkness in the world, doesn't make sense to me. And yet, what he's saying here is that, that can come from, some of my own numbness. And I think that that's true, and that there's guilt in a way, like, I guess probably, the guilt of, some of, having more than other people have, right? Or, like, and I don't have as many, near as much as others do, but it's kind of like, there's always this feeling, somehow that we're all in this together. And I always feel like, if other people are suffering, it doesn't really make any sense for me to suffer in the same way at one level, but there is some sense of, maybe numbness and guilt in that. So things like that, I think we're working with, in our current time in the world here. So he says a correlation must exist between one's numbness and one's approach or attitude toward the evil aspects of life. Some may be overly burdened, some may be overly sentimental, still others may be overly tough and indifferent toward the existence of evil. Any such overreaction must be connected with the numbness that in some respect has been instituted in the psyche. At one time, this numbness seemed like the only available protection. Later, it was unwittingly maintained. So now he's shifting a little into this second facet of evil that relates to control. So we'll come back and I think weave some of this back together again. But so there's this way that there's this importance, and he's mentioned it before, of relinquishing too tight a control. And then the failure to use those controls and powers that we have at our disposal for attaining a full, rich life. So, there's this kind of either overly tight thing or this sort of, like overly passive approach to, having a rich and full life. Where they're trying to make ourselves get it and driving ourselves and thinking we're bad because we should be doing more or whatever, or we've kind of collapsed or we don't feel like we can even be that way. And so we feel, helpless a little and that kind of thing. So the imbalance this failure creates induces rigidity where flexibility should exist, as well as a helpless loss of self where resilient firmness should prevail. The imbalance is always caused by the ignorance of and lack of differentiation between outer and inner self. So I think this is a really important concept. Like in most of our world, we mostly think about our outer self and like the outer will and the outer control. And so we forget about this inner self. And so he's really calling us to make this connection here to another level, and everything that, we want to manifest that we feel like somehow we can't, our outer will doesn't work, or, somehow the conditions of life block it and prevent us from manifesting it, or all of these things. Like it's the confusion of, not working through the inner will. And so he's going to talk about that a little bit. Oh, there it is. All suffering is related to helplessness. And I think you might agree with that statement, right? The greater the helplessness, the less the person is able to avoid pain. Children are, by their very nature, helpless, weak, and dependent. Hence, the suffering they may experience requires some means, such as the numbing process, of weakening its impact. The helplessness continues to exist in adults whose psyches have remained childish or immature. The trouble spots in one's inner life are always marked by this feeling of utter helplessness, while in the healthy areas this feeling is absent. It is obvious that helplessness and lack of control are very much connected. This is also where the authority and all of that kind of stuff comes in. And so since helplessness causes pain, and pain causes numbness, and numbness leads to evil, it becomes clear that imbalance and lack of control are also connected with evil. On a broader scale, helplessness is one of humanity's greatest problems. The significance of this is vastly overlooked. People feel helpless toward their own body. There is a considerable area where you have control. This area broadens to the extent that you have found your inner or real self. Where you are distorted and the real self is hidden from your awareness, control ends. It is then that you feel helpless, weak, and afraid. The relationship between your body, your feelings, and your personal life circumstance is the same when it comes to control. You have direct control over certain of your bodily functions. You can move your skeletal muscles at will. You can determine with your outer or ego self when and how to use certain muscles and when and how to move. In fact, a number of your physical functions are under the direct jurisdiction of your outer will and cannot work unless outer will is exerted. To summarize, all bodily functions are under the direct control of your outer ego. Those are the voluntary bodily functions. I don't know if I read that correctly, but so that's what it means. What voluntary means is that, and so there's certain voluntary functions that are all of those voluntary functions. We can use the outer will. But there is a vast area of your body the outer will cannot directly reach. These functions are not under the jurisdiction of the outer will. They work in perfect order without any deliberate or determined action of your will. They cease to function well without any apparent determination of your outer will. The inner bodily functions are not governed by outer control. This is frightening for you because you do not understand it. You feel you have no power over a vast area of your body and are at its mercy. The same applies to psychic processes. You have indisputable control over a vast area of your actions, over the words you speak, over your choice of thoughts. You seem to have no control over your spontaneous feeling reactions. This too can be quite frightening. You may want to feel one thing, but you cannot make yourself do so. You may hate to feel another emotion, but you are unable to prevent it. From suppression and repression, as you all know, strange and even more disquieting compulsions arise, with the result that you feel even more helpless in the grip of your own personality. So, you may relate to that, like see, where you feel kind of helpless in the grip of your own personality. Even though such thoughts may not be put into concise words, the feeling is, if I do not even have jurisdiction over my body or my own reactions and feelings, and if a frightening power which I do not know and cannot control seems to be at work within me, how much more helpless must I be in the face of life itself? Actually, the correlation between the self and life is very direct. You do not have any more control over the faculties of your inner body and psychic processes than you have over your life, nor do you have less. To the extent that you have found the key to your inner processes, you have found the key to the apparently fateful occurrences governing your life. Unfathomable fate seems to control your inner body, your spontaneous reactions, and a number of outer circumstances. But is it true that you must be separated from your inner faculties? Do you really have no control over them? Or can a connection be established between your consciousness and your inner body, your spontaneous feelings, and your life? So does this make sense? He's saying, like our experience is, that our outer will is limited, and he's saying that's true. But he's also saying that we don't know about an inner aspect of our being that, can get established. There can be a connection that can be established between the consciousness and sort of these, deeper non-volitional aspects of our inner body, of our spontaneous feelings, and of the things that befall us in life, and like what we manifest in life, what we accomplish, what we can create. And he's saying that, to try to do it with the outer will has lots of limiting results. But there is a way when we connect to the higher self and the inner will that more can, be manifested and a different experience of life can happen. So the same relationship exists in life as between body and feelings. You have direct control over certain happenings. Your outer direct will can determine certain actions which you know are bound to produce certain effects. If you do this, it must have that effect. But then, as with the body, the world of your feelings, there is an area where this immediate direct control ceases. Hence, the relationships with your body, your inner world of feelings, and your outer life are all the same. They are divided by a borderline up to which you have obvious direct influence to mold events and results, and beyond which this seems not to be so. There another a power appears to be at work over which you have no jurisdiction, a power you do not understand and therefore fear. From this idea that a strange, independent power seems to play with you. This is our God image, right? The concept of an outer God has arisen. A God who needs to be implored and appeased. Finding the true nature of this power is the ultimate aim of human spiritual development. The Spirit knows that human destiny is to find the true nature of this power and to extend this power over fate. But this message, coming from the depths of your spiritual being, often reaches the outer regions of the personality in a mangled and distorted way because of the misconceptions and confusions. So you strive toward this end, but in the wrong way. You often attempt it by tensing your outer will and trying to assert it over regions where it has no jurisdiction. Thus you misdirect the will faculties of your outer ego. So let me pause there for a second and see any questions, comments. This is deep. This is a lot. How are you doing? Are you able to follow it? Is it making sense?
Well, back to that opening, where it's a juxtaposition or a combination of the other and I, or say, when I think of the cruelty out, I think of the aggressor, which is not me, and then the receptive sort of person and laid back person, which is me. And I think of the in between, the balance, uh, or I can call the balance the interaction. And I've been working with that to particularly deal with folks that are around me who I call aggressors, or persons who are up to ulterior motives, and they're trying to say use me or use the folks around them. So that's kind of what I've been working with lately, to like, okay, accept them as the evil too, and try to seek balance. And so one word I use with one of these folks is, now I look at our dialogues, which the other person kind of recently had told me, well, our dialogues cause fires or earthquakes sometimes, meaning they're unsettling to the other person, or we're in disagreement. And I told the person, because of my new view lately I've been working with, to try to like ease my body with them in the situations. I said, well, it's kind of like the whole process for me now. I decided to look, and I look at it as a jam band. Like we're in a jam band together. So before I got to that realization, I kind of would just say, that's not my type of person. That's the type of person I would avoid. And, I think for the last most greater part of this year, it's been like, okay, I have to accept these people. And I also have to look at them with a mirror, like whatever they're doing, I'm doing somewhere in my life in some category. So that kind of brought me into the whole idea recently where, well, I'm in a jam band when we interact, meaning I look at them as a mirror. I don't exactly see what I'm doing, what they're doing, but I just wait to see it. And what I've started to do is, since I don't like what they're doing, because I'm definitely never been an aggressor. And those are the main folks I kind of have issues with my whole life, aggressors. I kind of started to say, well, okay, I'm going to interact with them. I'm going to accept them, like in a Buddhist sort of way. And then I started looking at the dialogues recently as like a jam band, improvisation. And that's helped me to relax, because like me, I always think myself, ultimately, I'm a yogi. I just want my body relax. And that's in the ultimate metaphorical sense. Like if I'm in an alley somewhere and the person's a mugger, they have a gun or a knife, well, okay, I accept I'm going to die, but I still want to be relaxed at that moment. And so I kind of looked at them like recently, the current aggressors, as like, okay, we're in a jam band together. And since I'm mirroring you, meaning like I accept whatever you're doing, I'm doing it somewhere in my life, I'm going to decide to intentionally do the opposite of what you're doing. So if you're coming at me with a sullen seriousness or rage, instead of being in a rage too from the fear of, oh God, they're attacking me, I'm going to defend myself by these accusations they're making against me. I decided to just do the opposite, be light, be humorous. And, I've come to observe how quickly that works in my favor. Like the interaction between us lasts longer. I find myself making us both laugh at spontaneous comments that I couldn't even have thought of. And so I kind of really realized, okay, the communication and the dialogue and interaction is a jam band. And the other big word that's kind of been like maybe a month or two is the balance. Like, how can I balance this jamming and not resist it and just do the opposite?
So I think what you're referring to here, Kenny, like, there's is like you're activating that inner self, right? That can, make those choices and, like hold peace and calm, instead of getting triggered or reactivated, and there's a choice that you're making to do that, but that choice is happening, I think, at this level of what the guide is talking about, because if we try to make that choice from the outer will and we are like emotionally kind of swept away, or trauma or triggered by in some way, right? It's like we don't have that kind of control. So I think you're sort of demonstrating the difference between, like, at a certain level of the work that you're doing is more, working with what he's referring to here in terms of accessing, this deeper inner will aspect and making our choices from there and working with, it's kind of like our higher self that also accepts all of the rest of us and, accepts all of everybody. And yeah, it does look for, where we are mirroring. And this is part of what the path work does, is it also helps us see more precisely. I mean, we can know, yeah, probably, we have something of that in ourselves. But if it's completely hidden, it's like it's probably, maybe, we're just not in touch with something yet, or maybe we have evolved, and it's no longer like we've cleared it, and it's because that's what we're in, is this healing process where, according to the pathwork, we actually bring in, some of that, and we have to kind of get caught in it and lost in it, and then we find our way and set it free, and continue on our an evolution of service, right? But there's the first level of the work that we're doing, which is working with some kind of, prior incarnation, maybe some, piece of uh, trauma or pain body or something that we brought in, and images, that are not ultimately in reality. And so anyway, it just feels like what you're saying is that a lot of what you've done is sort of, worked with this inner will aspect. And so he's saying, yeah, that finding the true nature of that power is the ultimate aim of human spiritual development. And so the spirit knows that human destiny is to find the true nature of this power and to extend this power over fate. Extend it over our reactions, extend it over, like getting mugged even, like, yeah, maybe you do surrender, but maybe also, that no longer becomes, a likely experience that you're gonna, have to face as you, continue to work, with, like this inner part of your being that can determine, like the inner will, right? The inner intentionality, the inner choice that we make from this deeper heart space, right? And not just the mind, but the heart. So he says that the message coming from the depths of your spiritual being reaches the outer regions of the personality, but in this way that, is mangled, and we have all these misconceptions and confusions. So I think I read this, but let me go ahead and repeat it. You strive toward this end, but in the wrong way, and you attempt it by tensing. So when we're still not using, we don't know about the inner will. That's what he's saying, and so then oftentimes the, personality tries to, use the outer will and the tensing, and they try to assert it over regions where it has no jurisdiction. And so we wear ourselves out, we frustrate ourselves, we think we're doing it wrong because we can't sort of make our willpower make us do what we think we should be doing or whatever. And so he says, thus you misdirect the will faculties of your outer ego. And we need to connect and rely on, sort of these inner will faculties. So I don't know, did I, Kenny, I hope that kind of connected for what you were saying, but I appreciate, what you were sharing. So thanks.
It did. Thank you.
Yeah. So those of you, my friends, who have grown through years of effort in this pathwork have occasionally noticed that where you were once helpless, you are no longer helpless at all. You not only discover power, strength, resourcefulness, and adequacy, qualities you never dreamed you possessed, but you also begin to see that a remote control seems to be at work governing your fate and your outer life circumstances. You realize that your control expands. You experience how the areas where you lack control recede, and the new formed areas of control are not under direct control by work, but work by remote control. So he's calling this sort of, going through this inner will, this inner process of connecting with, sort of the inner will and the inner self, that it's a form of affecting our outer and our feeling and everything else, but it's not with the direct outer will control, but it's with this remote control of the higher self, of the inner will, something like that. So this extension of control does not and cannot happen through a rigid tightening of the ego forces of will or mind or reasoning. It happens instead by an indirect process of remote control, which eventually becomes direct. To be more specific, your ego faculties have to be used, but not in the way that this is usually attempted. They can and must be used to diminish the strength of the outer will. So he's saying, like we usually use our ego faculties to try to strengthen the outer will. He's saying, like, really what we're trying to do is, relax the outer will. The idea that outer will is omnipotent must be relinquished, and the outer faculties must entrust themselves to the inner. So he's saying that there's something within us that we don't even know is there until we actually can relinquish sort of our reliance on this outer, fear-based ego that's trying to control and relax and discover something else is available. At first, this may appear confusing or even contradictory, but when you comprehend it more deeply, you will undoubtedly come to understand, once again, the work we are involved with here. When you understand that there is a vaster intelligence, immediately very accessible within yourself, no faraway deity separated from you, but an immediate and integral part of yourself. When you realize this, you will know that what I have said here is true. You will see at first remote control working where there had been absolutely no intervention, connection, or control. And then eventually remote control will turn into more direct control. At first, this cannot be more than a theory you must test with good faith, willingness, and openness. Later, the theory is bound to turn into fact and into experienced reality. If you wish to exert control over areas inaccessible to your outer will, for example, inner bodily processes, you overexert yourself, weakening your energies and courting disappointment and frustration. If you understand, however, that all inner processes, inner body, inner feelings, inner life, manifesting in fate and apparently coming from outside, can be governed, but only by the inner person, you will not waste valuable ego energy. Instead, you will use your outer mind to make contact with the inner self, so it does what needs to be done. When you realize this, it becomes feasible. So that makes sense, like he's saying, the inner self cannot act without our outer, ego turning to it and asking for it or reaching towards it. We have to. It says you will use your outer mind to make contact with the inner self, so it does what needs to be done. And then he says, how can that inner self be activated? It cannot be activated by itself, for it responds only to consciousness. Your outer as well as inner consciousness has the power to direct this inner being with all its marvelous resources, with its intelligence and power. This inner being, in turn, has jurisdiction over the inner processes. People have no inkling about the limitless possibilities extending far above and beyond what they believe to be natural law. Once they are understood, the true significance of life and of meditation will be absorbed, lived, and experienced. There will no longer be a problem or confusion about the use of faculties. What is vastly overlooked is that the limitations of the outer ego faculties exist only as long as you fail to understand that these same ego faculties are to be used to directly contact the inner self, which then will control and give us effective, unhelplessness. I don't like the word control exactly, but it's like there's a way that, it's like it's responsive. And so that includes our physical health, our body, feelings, and apparent fate. The outer consciousness must be used to activate the inner consciousness. In spite of the tremendous power of the latter, it responds only to a direct and deliberate effort of the outer mind. It is this two-step, indirect approach to the power of the inner self that establishes what I call remote control. This control begins to work more and more as the personality removes distortions and misconceptions embedded in the psyche. These distortions create a barrier between the outer and the inner consciousness. But as more insight is gained little by little and the destructive attitudes change, the cooperation between the outer and the inner self extends the areas of control. At first, this appears to be almost coincidental. Occasional certainties are put in doubt again by unavoidable relapses, and that's, I can tell you, is true. You know quite well that in the process of growth, problems do not vanish in one sweep. Remnants are left that continue to act up until all distortions disappear. What was once a mystery and random fate to which one was helplessly exposed, over which one had no control, gradually becomes visible as cause and effect operating by remote control, and as opposed to the direct control of outer faculties. So I think I might have read that funny. Let me try it again. What was once a mysterious and random fate to which one was helplessly exposed, over which one had no control, becomes gradually visible as cause and effect operating by remote control, as opposed to the direct control of outer faculties. So we always think, I don't want this. How did I create this? This isn't what I, intended any part of me, but he's saying, that this is, where it's like operating and the effect is coming out of this other remote control and these deeper inner unconscious processes that are sort of manifesting the recreation of the problem or the pain body or whatever. So, again, it's operating under remote control, and yet, we haven't accessed the wisdom of the higher self that can, get in there and also help with those parts. So he says, as this process continues, control when to let go of the outer faculties, when to relinquish tight over control, and when to use outer will in the proper way. It's no longer a problem. It kind of clarifies. We have confusion about that. And so once that happens, then it is not necessary any longer to numb oneself to cope with helpless exposure to pain, for you are no longer helpless. So it's an interesting promise that he's offering here, a vision of some possibility, of sort of this higher, this connection to this inner part of ourselves, and that through that, we have the outer, we learn how to let go of the outer faculties, and when that they need to be applied, and when to surrender, and trust in the inner faculties, and relax into sometimes unknown, or acceptance of what seems to be difficult, but the more that we do that, we discover how it kind of carries us through, and the highest possible thing can happen out of that. And so we begin to learn how to, gain this control, sort of this remote control over our lives. So now we have a few Q&As. Let's pause here and see anybody want to comment about what we've gone through so far.
So from what I've gotten so far up to this point, it was the inner feelings, like the literal inner physical feelings, like how we do in the deep focusing, is kind of a manifestation of like the outer world. And when we fail to acknowledge these inner feelings, these inner physical manifestations, it can create a situation of numbness because these feelings are very uncomfortable and we don't want to feel them, like such as in the example earlier of feeling, well, not acknowledging those vulnerable feelings and trying to control that inner manifestation of the physical. And then on top of that, if you're like me and cut off from higher self or from a divine presence, those inner uncomfortable feelings can manifest into the outer. And if we don't acknowledge the vulnerability within those inner feelings, the outer is not going to change.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, good. And may get, number or indifferent or actively cruel, kind of separating out of life, right?
yeah.
Separating out of the heart connection, the deeper, presencing of, like ourselves with each, with our own selves, and then with each other. So that sounds right. And then, the antidote to that in a way is this, is doing this, feeling and connecting, and, and as you're doing that, you are activating, you are, many times, you've gotten, some thought form come into the mind that seemed, like probably from your higher self, or your guides or something, that inner intelligence, right? However we want to characterize it. And so when we listen inside, when we get present to that stuff, we begin to access more and more of that inner truth and wisdom. And then as, we learn about sort of accepting, that we can't force it to happen and work with it in this other way, sort of in this remote control way that the guide is saying, it's like, and we stop resisting and suffering in the old dynamic, right? Then a new life is kind of born. Anybody else?
I've always maintained that we have two egos. We have the superficial ego and we have a mature ego. And this, what we've been reading here, seems to be, to me, the difference between the two. Like,
Huh?
the autopilot reactions of the superficial ego, which involves all of the um, images and
Fences.
and distorted beliefs systems that circle around the superficial ego lead to, you know, uh, the autopilot reaction.
Yeah,
And
the numbing, the
and once we
defenses.
realize that we have a mature ego that can activate the higher self, and we learn how to use that mature ego to activate the higher self, then everything becomes a different landscape. We can have a different reaction to the situation. That's kind of what's coming to me about the whole thing,
I
you know.
think that's right. I mean, he certainly does say that, we have to use the ego to activate the higher self. And, it's probably not the reactive, immature, defensive ego parts, right, that we're using. It is more this I am, he often says that, that there's an aspect of the ego that is connected to the higher self, so it's that self in presence, that objective observer, has lots of different
Right.
terms, but yeah. And
Yeah.
it's our intent, our conscious will, like, oh, I'm you know tuning in here intentionally, to feel the pain, and I'm also, seeking, transformation or healing or understanding from the higher self, or you know and so when we go into that place of doing our work, it's like a prayer. It's like you know revealing to the light, uh, what we're holding, and in a way offering it, and then we're acknowledging it. We're uh, not trying to avoid it, but we're not trying to, like, necessarily fix it or make it right or wrong. It just is, and then we call the light there to be with it. And it will, the guide is saying everything, is originally the light, and so even if this has some distortion, some pain body, some drama trauma with it, that's it's through the holding it in the light of the heart, in the you know presence of love and acceptance, and you know uh, fully embracing it. This is where he's saying, instead of numbing to ourselves, we befriend ourselves,
Yeah.
and then we befriend the others.
Yeah. And I will admit that I feel challenged every day by this reaction to evil, because there's just so much of it going on.
Yeah.
Uh, so
Yeah,
much.
and I'm hoping that maybe reading all of these lectures will help us find new things about that. And I think in this lecture, like I thought it was really interesting what he said at the very beginning. I don't know if you were there, Frank. It's kind of at the beginning of the lecture, but something about, that um, if we're having a difficulty with the amount of evil in the world, that it may indicate someplace where we are numb, and like there's a piece of our own involved in that. So
Oh, yeah,
mhm.
absolutely. I mean, I feel a default mechanism towards numbness working inside of my psyche
and,
around
and
this whole thing.
right,
I feel it. I
and
observe it.
uh-huh. And he says, we naturally have a guilt reaction, like he talks about the guilt for not loving, right? The only true guilt is the guilt for not loving. That comes up in another lecture. And so like our numbness automatically brings up, I think, this guilt for not loving that, is part of, like the vicious circle then of the denial of everything.
Mhm.
So should we go back to the Q&As and see what else is there? Anybody else have any? Okay, let's share screen again. So I would like to, this is the question from somebody in the audience. It says, I would like to connect what you said with the problem I have. It seems that I have a tendency to feel overburdened by the cruelty existing in the world. Going back to my childhood, I discovered that one of my pseudo-solutions is to withdraw. Now, when I do withdraw, I automatically withdraw my love. Is there guilt involved in this? Answer, yes, but there are also other ramifications. As I have explained in this lecture, when you withdraw love, you become numb. So that's another interesting way to think about it, kind of in reverse. We often think, we become numb and then the love is blocked. But it's like if we withdraw love, then we come, so there's some kind of like an active. And again, he talks about love as not being, it's like a soul movement. It's not a commandment. So again, the outer will is not effective in trying to make ourselves feel love, right? But, it's like he is saying that, if we withdraw, then, it's like that is a withdrawal of love and a numbness. So although this numbness during childhood was a protective shield against cruelty from the outside, it does not prevent the negative emotions in the inner makeup, such as rage, fear, and anger from arising. So it's interesting, we get numb a little bit to the pain or whatever, but not to the negative feelings, the negative emotions. These emotions cannot be numbed. They can only be hidden. This then increases guilt. If you were to translate into concise words what is taking place in the personality, you would say, here I am, fearing the cruelty from the outside, fearing the rage and the indifference of the world. The injustice of others is due to their insensitivity to me. In my fear of this injustice, this insensitivity, indifference, cruelty, and rage, I make myself as numb as they must be. So the fear, all of that, is part of what is, driving the numbness. The guilt expresses clearly that one resents in others what one feels compelled to perpetuate, in the misunderstanding that a similar, though disguised, trend is a protection. So that's kind of deep. I don't know if we can follow it exactly, but he's kind of like, again, talking about how much there's projection, right? And we're really, like what we think is going on, where we're, seeing it out in others. There is somewhere that we need to really kind of recognize, like find the similar though disguised trend, and to understand the protection, right? The psyche says, I stop myself from warm, loving feelings to protect myself. So, we're always feeling like, oh, I want connection, I want warmth, I want love, but then we don't give love, or we block our own, so this is part of what he's saying. And in spite of the numbing effect on certain emotions, I cannot desensitize my own rage and anger. And then this compounds the guilt. So let me read that one more time, maybe. It's like I think it had a lot there and was a little. I was following most of it. I'm not sure I got the whole thing myself. So it says, so the question is, like that when he withdraws, he automatically withdraws love, and so there's guilt in that. And then the guide is saying, and other ramifications, that when you withdraw love, you become numb. And although this numbness during childhood was a protective shield against cruelty from the outside, it does not prevent the negative emotions in the inner makeup. So, like, when we protect and withdraw, we also, or people, are, instead of reaching out in connection, like that there's this protective shield against the cruelty from the outside. Like, I think it's what Frank was saying, we have difficulty because even though we're trying to shield against the cruelty from outside, we still feel, our rage and our fear and our anger and our reaction to every little, affront that, it seems like those people seem to provoke from us. And so these emotions can't be numbed. They can be hidden, but this only increases guilt. So then he says, if we're to translate it into concise words, what is taking place in the personality? You would say, here I am, fearing the cruelty from the outside. I feel my fear, like it feels somehow personal, even though it's happening to those other people. I feel like it could come to me, fearing the rage and the indifference of the world, right? And then the injustice of others, seeing that that's due to their insensitivity to me, like I'm always wanting them to wake up, be sensitive to me, but they always harden their hearts, they don't. And so in my fear of this injustice, my fear of this insensitivity, this indifference, this cruelty and rage, I have to make myself as numb as they must be. And so, again, I often feel like I do have to kind of thaw myself, right? It's like when I'm up to here with things, sometimes more personal, but oftentimes, like I just have to like go in and it feels like the tears and the grief is the, kind of antidote to the numbness. And so I often find myself sort of sitting in that numbness, dropping down through the layers into the place of release of the sadness, of the grief, of the hurt, of the child that is afraid, right? If I can touch into her, then she feels like also connected with and releases and feels better. So it's like I have to actively keep the sensitivity flowing, the feelings flowing, and so that the heart stays open. So regarding the physical functions that are beyond our control, is it this rage and anger as well as the guilt that creates sickness? So answer, of course. Let me put it this way. All the destructive emotions that are hidden underground create problems, hazards, difficulties that manifest in the physical, emotional, or mental system, or in the outer life circumstances of a person. It is true that these hidden negative emotions that come from distorted values and wrong concepts create illness. But it is also true that the outer self can have access to the inner self to create a state of helpless endurance instead of correcting, healing, improving, and preventing negative occurrences in the future. So I'm not quite sure I understand this whole thing, but he's saying something about that the outer self, sort of perpetuates it. And I do know that, like we can go into a state of endurance, right? And just kind of keep contracting and motoring on, and the outer will keeps us going. And that, that's not gonna, bring about the correcting, healing, improving and preventing in the future. And when one feels one is a victim of fate, of powers outside one's control, one is likely to overlook the most obvious and direct resources. So again, we're talking about these inner self resources. The knowledge that the outer and inner self have to cooperate to bring order, harmony, truth, and fulfillment will enable people to use their energies in the right direction. It is the inner being that builds, maintains, and reinstitutes health. Ignoring its presence and its power must make people helpless victims. It is the inner being that can create a constructive life in which everything is given everything is given that is needed from the outside, because no inner barriers exist. So again, like we think of negativity just, but our lack of self-worth can block our capacity to receive everything that we want, in our lives. So it doesn't have to be just, it can be any distortion, any not true thing, and sort of our guilt and our, like confusion about who we are, I think also, is part of this, circle that keeps us from feeling the truth of our inner being and the deserving or the ability to, activate this part of us to, feel more fulfilled and to have the things that we need. So he says it is the inner person who has to be contacted with the outer ego faculties of will and mind. This should be done very simply and directly, but what stands in the way must be removed. So there's kind of two stages. So we have to notice where the blocks are and remove those. And the removal, too, happens faster and more adequately when the inner being is enlisted. And then we have to enlist the inner being to activate the, potential. So let us finish this lecture with the following suggestion for meditation. Let us combine control through the inner being with giving up the unconscious deliberate numbness. The way to approach the relationship between the outer ego faculties of mind and will and the inner being for the purpose of eliminating numbness might be the following. So this is a quote. So see if you can just kind of repeat inside of yourself after me and feel this, as part of your intention as well. My outer directed will cannot reach those areas where I have numbed my perception, experience, feeling, and sensitivity. Therefore, I wish to contact my inner being of higher intelligence and greater power than my outer mind, to take the necessary steps to defrost these faculties, to bring them to life, so that I will become a fully functioning human being. Wherever there is fear and misconception, I wish to understand them so that I may eliminate what stands in the way. It is the useless prohibitions I do not yet quite know that cause me to be only partly alive. So, we don't even quite know, but inside of us we have a bunch of useless prohibitions that block the flow of our life force. And we don't even have to know them, but we can activate this higher self by, claiming I want to be fully alive. To bring this about, I contact the inner self to help eliminate obstructions, bring to my consciousness what I need to know so that I will reawaken and live in the state of fulfillment, selfhood, and beauty. So, very beautiful sort of inner meditation. He says you do not need to repeat these words exactly. Use your own words, your individual way of verbalizing and expressing the essence of these thoughts. This would be the approach, my friends. Be blessed, every one of you, in the continuation of your path. May you feel, every one of you, the light of truth and love that life could be if you so choose. when you take the right and constructive steps to integrate the outer and the inner being through actively establishing contact between them, life can be infinitely more than you could wish for. Life is no more and no less than what you allow it to be, the best or the worst, or the many grades in between. Life is no more and no less than what your consciousness expresses. The limits you set on your fulfillment, like the limits you believe exist regarding control, are entirely arbitrary. They depend on your belief. To the extent that you know the powers of your inherent faculties, you will possess the world. But these inherent powers dwell in the inner person and not in the outer ego self. The extent of the realization of your inner faculties depends on the sum total of your consciousness, on your beliefs, your concepts, your expressions. All this in turn depends on how free your inner being is to manifest or how obstructed it is. When you have numbed your feelings, the inner self is inactivated. It alone is capable of making you and life one, in the best sense of the word. Be in peace, be in God. Okay. So, any last thoughts or comments here?
The numbing. Kind of like that separation of the ego self, the outer will, not asking God for help, right? Especially when these feelings are numbing and trying to get to the point where to get to the point of these vulnerable feelings. I notice within myself that when it comes to my God image, it's about shame and about feeling guilty for things that I've done that are evil. But when I look out in the outer world, right, it's like, well, I guess God forgives them because they get to do whatever they want and get away with it. And then it's like it gives me this image, well, nobody gives a shit about morality, including God, so why am I feeling all these feelings of shame and guilt for things that I do and then it brings up the anger, right? So what I'm numbing is that anger at God because I'm feeling the shame and the guilt for me, but then everybody else gets to do what the fuck they want.
Yeah. Yeah, good. And again, it's that it's the projection of, I thought it was really interesting in this lecture because, it's like, yeah, it is kind of implying the God image and the God principle. And yet, it's like he's very clearly saying this is an aspect of our own being. And so, like there's a way in which I get what you're saying, because a lot of times the shame and, like we don't feel like we deserve because we are sensitive and we have caring or whatever, and our conscience speaks to us, and it doesn't seem to speak to those other people. And the guide says that in one of the lectures, he says, it's like in some ways it appears people get away with it, because they're not in conflict internally. And so what they're manifesting is that lack of conflict, it's like it's okay for them to, you know, take advantage of people and have all of these things that they want. he's saying it, that there's a way that the soul evolves, and like realizes that, maybe there's a consequence to that in time. But in this situation, right? Yeah, what they're manifesting again, it's like seems to be aligned. So, but for us, I think that there is this, real way that to begin to see this part of our own being that really does see us through the eyes of God, or somehow try to imagine, like what, like a really loving, but also objective, knows all of your, you're not hiding, there's no mask, right? It's like, but that weighs the heart, ultimately, or sees that, yeah, we all have our shit, but this is a divine soul, and has the, a capacity, for that divine love, and has activated it to varying degrees, and is blocked in other degrees, right? We're all in some way like that. And so to kind of like begin to see if you can even see yourself through a little more, like not just the eyes of the sort of guilty one, but like we can acknowledge that that's a part of you, that feels that way, but there's this other thing that he's pointing to, that is this loving, wise, intelligent spark of the divine within us. And it cares about us, it wants to guide us, it wants to, it really is who we are. And so it's like it's kind of the the shaper and the guider of the personality as it struggles to find its way in this material and dualistic world, right? And so, between that and I think our guardian angel, maybe, which I understand, like is truly an angelic being that comes to live our whole life with us, without any control. Like if we go through pain, they go through pain. If we go through good, so, but they do it, like in this way of being, support and connecting through us, and helping us. So, but we are here, I think, trying to awaken, to recognize this inner part of our being, and that has, I think, great capacity that we haven't activated, because as long as we are in duality, and as long as we still have our lower selves, we would be like, the, you know a god that, like got pissy, and kind of a high chair tyrant, and decided to, like wipe out whole civilizations or worlds, because we have an intemperate. So we have to kind of have our hearts wide open, and everything, to have the power of the divine. We have to have the love and the truth and the justice of the divine.
It's just, personally, it's just hard for me to see through that lens, because I can also see, since it's a mirror, right? I'm getting angry at God, but I'm also seeing what they're getting away with, and it's like, that's not fair. Um, and I'm pointing the finger, and then it's like you said before, there's three pointing right back. And if I'm a mirror, I'm doing what they're doing. I can accept that, but I just can't accept.
They get
I
away
can
with it. They have good results
no,
with. No, okay,
no,
sorry.
it's not that. It's I can accept the mirror where I'm doing what they're doing, but I just can't, knowing that, say, please God, I need help because I'm doing what they're doing.
Because somehow since you know you don't feel like you have the right to ask for help, or you don't really
Mm.
feel deserving of
Yeah.
any
Yeah.
something, or I don't know. Say more.
It's
Interesting.
more, yeah, I don't feel deserving of it because I'm a mirror. I'm doing
Mhm,
the evil that I'm pointing out. I'm doing the same because it's a mirror, right? That's why I'm getting triggered.
mhm. Yeah, but kind of like to understand yourself in that mirror helps you understand others, right? Again, to understand your own numbness, it's like it's all protection, but the protection doesn't work. So we have to give it up, and then yeah, I don't know, like I get, like there's a lot of darkness and evil, and it's hard to like open our hearts to it. I'm not saying that everybody we need to figure that out and just do it, because I think it's part of the journey. But I know for sure that we can't open our hearts to them if we can't open our hearts to ourselves, just as we are. So maybe what you're saying is, yeah, if I open my heart to myself, then I have to like forgive them, or get like give them dispensation too, or something, and I don't want to do that. um, yeah, and I can feel that too, but I think there is a way in which there's something that if we can see that we are 50-50, and everybody in some ways are 50-50, we all have our light and we have our darkness, that there's just this kind of underlying process, right? Of um, like if I choose, like I see I have darkness, but I don't justify it, or I recognize when I justify it, and I'm making the prayer of transformation. I'm asking to find a way that doesn't, that does purify, that doesn't, keep recycling all of this stuff. Then it seems like that intention, that inner, that's the part of the outer will choosing and activating the inner will. And I think most people that are here doing this work, some part of them is seeking that, or is wanting that. It's like, and is willing to, like, again, it's not an overnight thing, but say like help, and I want more joy and happiness in the world, and less, you know, numbness, separation, and frustration and evil, or anger, you know. Hey, Kenny, were you trying to come in there?
Yeah, well, my voice is here at least. Can you hear
Yeah, I
me?
know we're going quite late, so you're free to like hang up too. But do you have any? I couldn't tell whether you wanted to speak.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so, well, with this lecture, I'm feeling like I'm seeing, or my biggest fear right now, which is the active part of, like, I've always seen the other, but I've always kind of been complacent to like just observing and knowing it's the other is me. But kind of I felt my fear is the active part of balancing, and paired with the fact that it's constant, it's never ceasing. And that means I have to actually be moving and working. And also that paired with the fact that of the whole being in the middle of a predicament, eternally some predicament that I don't know how to swim out. Like I gotta swim and improvise. So that's kind of picked up that about myself. That's like the biggest anxiety, angst, not anxiety, but angst. To like, God, it's a nonstop swimming to the next other and to the next, not knowing. And so, I mean, that's rich for me because I
Yeah.
couldn't. Yeah,
Yeah. And that's, again, sort of like to me, that feels like, okay, so, it's a part of you that's adapted in that way, and kind of like sees the world through sort of that, like, I mean, you're right, it is one thing after another, right? But it's kind of like when we feel that as a challenge and a difficulty, rather than sort of like my imagination from the higher self, right? Is that you're just in this wide open field, fully present, and moment to moment, being in that presence, you're sort of guided, sort of spontaneously from within, how to respond to that, and just kind of be in your flow. And I think that the wisdom comes from that. The healing interactions might come from that, and it doesn't feel like it's effortful in the same way that I hear you describing this. Now, I may not be following you exactly, but
No,
that.
you are, because you just helped me get some relief where I said, well, maybe I'll see myself as I always see myself as an artist, like with life. Just look at it aesthetically, not I have to, but
Yeah, yeah,
aesthetically. But you made me see myself for relief in this instant as an abstract artist, always starting from the abstract into making some sort of form. So just kind of look at it that way. I'm an abstract artist. I have no idea what this mess is, but just read it out and there'll be some form that, okay, I like that. So that helped.
yeah, yeah. It is, and I think life is kind of like that. It's like we have no idea what's going. We're just meeting the moment and responding in that moment, and out of that, the creation happens. Okay, Frank, you got any last words, or I think you're muted. You're on mute, Frank. Yeah, there you
Part
go.
of me is thinking that, anger, like my justificate, I have a right to be angry about what I'm witnessing, okay? And maybe the anger, exercising that right to be angry, might be a little bit better than remaining numb. Okay? You know?
Absolutely. And what the
So,
guide is saying always, is like the anger is, like I mean, it's the our free will right to say no, right? I don't like this. This is not okay with me, etc. It's like, and he's saying that also, like the anger feels better, like the defense, the defiance, the resistance, the rebelliousness, right? Against the what is, feels better than feeling the pain of it, right? And that would be, I think, the completion. Like the anger is better than numbness, and then if we can get all the way through, from the anger into the grief,
mm,
right? Then I think we're in that space of unnumbing. And what I discover in my own journey, like the more I can release the grief, then the more I bounce back and have room for joy, have more resilience in the face of it. But it's just like I said, sometimes it just kind of weighs you down. And like when I end up feeling so heavy, I like I don't want to keep going, like I got things to do and I have no life force to do, then I want to go in and release the grief,
right.
and then the life comes back.
Mm.
Okay.
Okay,
Oh,
see you next time.
yep. Thank you,
Darlene.
everybody. Good
Thank
to
you, Darlene.
Good night, Frank. Good night, Kenny. Good night, Darlene.
Night.
Thank you, Darlene. Thank you, guys. Good night.
Good night.